Okay, so you want to buy a Formula One team, find a factory, hire the engineers, paint the car, show up on Sunday. That's the picture in your head. And for most of this sport's history, that picture was a lie. For decades, owning a Formula One team was one of the fastest ways for a rich person to become a less rich person. Teams folded, owners walked away with nothing. And yet today, the cheapest team on the entire grid is worth more than $1.5 billion, and the most valuable one is worth somewhere around $6.5 billion. Same sport, same 10 garages. A completely different business. So here's the real question. If this sport was quietly bankrupting its owners for 50 years, why is everyone suddenly fighting to get in? Every Formula One team operates under something called a cost cap. Think of it as a spending allowance set by the sport's governing body, the FIA. In 2021, when this rule was first introduced, that allowance was $145 million a year. It's been adjusted a few times since. By 2023, it had settled at around $135 million. And for the 2026 season, it jumps all the way up to $215 million. Mostly because new items have been folded into what counts under the cap, not because teams are suddenly allowed to spend more freely. Here's the part almost nobody outside the sport understands. That number is not the team's actual budget. It's the ceiling on one specific slice of the operation. Car design, race operations, most of the engineering staff. A huge chunk of what a team actually spends every year sits completely outside that number. Driver salaries don't count. The pay for the three most senior executives in the building doesn't count. Marketing, hospitality, and the customer engine contracts that midfield teams sign with manufacturers like Ferrari or Mercedes, none of that touches the cap. Add all of that back on top of the capped amount, and a competitive team's real annual spending lands somewhere between $250 and $350 million. And that's before a single point has been scored. Why does it cost this much just to exist? Because a Formula One car is not built the way your car was built. There is no assembly line. There is no factory in another country stamping out identical parts by the thousand. A single chassis is made up of roughly 5,000 individually designed components, each one modeled first inside a computer, tested against millions of hours of simulated airflow, shaped in a wind tunnel, then baked into its final form inside a pressurized oven called an autoclave. Nothing about this car is off the shelf. Then there's the part nobody thinks about until they see the invoice. Every single race weekend, a team has to move close to 50 tons of equipment somewhere in the world. Garages, spare parts, tools, computers, entire mobile workshops. 20-something races a year, spread across 5 continents. Some of that cargo travels by sea, because it's heavy and replaceable and doesn't need to be anywhere in a hurry. But the parts that matter, the ones the engineers might need mid-weekend, those fly. And flying freight of this size costs a team somewhere around $14 million a year, which works out to roughly $400 for every single kilogram in the air. Now, not every team spends at the same scale, even though they follow the same rule. Take a team like Haas. It runs with a few hundred employees, buys its gearbox and engine directly from Ferrari, and outsources much of its chassis design. That's a lean operation by design. Now compare that to Mercedes, which employs over 800 people at a single site in England and posted a turnover of roughly $848 million in a recent year. Same cap. Completely different company sitting underneath it, and this is before you count the cost of the engine itself. Teams that don't build their own engine, Haas, Williams, and several others, have to lease one from a manufacturer instead. A customer engine deal can run up to around $16 million a season, and that payment goes out whether the car finishes on the podium or doesn't finish at all. It's rent paid every single year for the single most important mechanical component on the entire car. So the costs are enormous, mostly fixed, and largely outside the driver's control, which raises the obvious question: where does all of this money actually come from? The first and biggest source of income is prize money, paid out by the organization that runs the commercial side of the sport, known as Formula One Management. Under the sport's master agreement with the teams, roughly 45% of the sport's total revenue gets funneled back to the 10 constructors every year. In a recent season, that pool was worth close to $1.5 billion combined. But it isn't split evenly. It's split according to where you finished in the championship the year before. The team at the top of that table takes home around 14% of the pool. The team at the bottom takes around 6%. Translate that into real numbers, and one single position on that final standings table, moving from 9th to 10th or 4th to 5th, is worth somewhere between $8 and $12 million. Finish one spot lower than expected, and you've just lost enough money to fund an entire department for a year. The second source is sponsorship. Not sponsorship in the sense of a small logo on a sidebar, Sponsorship in the sense of full commercial partnerships worth tens of millions of dollars a year. Red Bull's partnership with the technology company Oracle is reportedly worth around $500 million over 5 years. Deals like the multi-year commitment from the Saudi energy company Aramco with Aston Martin sit in a similar range. These contracts are worth $50 to $100 million a year for the biggest teams. And unlike prize money, they don't swing wildly based on where you finished on Sunday. The third source is direct funding from a parent car manufacturer. Mercedes and Ferrari both receive backing from their road car divisions because the racing team doubles as an advertisement and a technology laboratory for the company that owns it. Independent teams, the ones without a manufacturer parent, don't get this. They have to make up the difference through sponsorship and prize money alone. The fourth source is smaller but surprisingly profitable: side businesses. Teams rent out their wind tunnels and engineering expertise to other industries. Mercedes, for instance, has done paid engineering consulting work for a sailing team competing in the America's Cup. Then there's merchandise, licensing deals for video games, and paddock hospitality packages sold to wealthy fans and corporate guests for extraordinary sums. None of this shows up on race day, but it quietly keeps the lights on. None of these four streams behave the same way, and that's exactly the point. Prize money moves up and down with results, which makes it the most exciting number and the least reliable one. Sponsorship and manufacturer funding barely move at all from year to year, which makes them boring but essential. They're the floor that keeps a team standing even after a season nobody wants to remember. A smart team, in other words, isn't just chasing lap time. It's building a mix of income where the shaky, results-dependent slice doesn't sink the whole operation if the car underperforms for a year. Here's where it gets interesting, though. If every team is drawing from the same four pools, why does the actual money landing in each bank account look so wildly unequal? For decades, the sport's commercial agreements contained a quiet arrangement that had nothing to do with where a team finished on the track. Ferrari is the only constructor that has competed in every single season of the World Championship since it began in 1950. To keep Ferrari happy, and to keep the brand's prestige attached to the sport, the governing agreements have guaranteed the team a flat bonus, reportedly around 5% of the entire prize pool, simply for showing up. In a recent season, that alone was worth an estimated $63 million, on top of whatever Ferrari earned through actual results. Layer another historical bonus on top of that, tied to past championship success, and Ferrari's total payout in one recent season reportedly reached around $278 million, despite finishing fourth on the actual track. The team that finished first that year, McLaren, took home roughly $166 million. The team that came fourth out-earned the team that came first by more than $100 million. Mercedes has its own version of this, tied to its dominant run of championships through the middle of the 2010s, reportedly worth over $100 million a year in legacy payments, completely independent of current form. For years, the smaller independent teams argued that this system was rigged in favor of a handful of historic brands, and that these payments let the giants build better facilities and hire better engineers while everyone else fought over scraps. Much of this structure was negotiated decades ago by Bernie Ecclestone, the man who ran the sport's commercial arm for most of its modern history, and who used private team-by-team deals to keep the biggest names loyal and prevent them from breaking away to start a rival series. Even after the American company Liberty Media bought the sport in 2017 and tried to flatten some of these disparities, the legacy payments never fully disappeared. So knowing all of that, knowing the money is unequal, knowing some teams are structurally disadvantaged before the season even begins, why would any billionaire willingly buy into this? Because for the people writing the check, the team was never really the product. The team was the advertisement. Take the Canadian billionaire Lawrence Stroll. In 2020, he led a group that invested roughly £500 million to take a controlling stake in the struggling British luxury car company, Aston Martin, and folded his existing Formula One team into the Aston Martin name. Every time that car appears on television in front of a global audience, it's not really selling lap times. It's selling the idea that Aston Martin builds cars capable of surviving at the very edge of engineering. That halo effect helped the company launch limited-run cars costing around $1 million each and push its average selling price up toward the equivalent of roughly $230,000 per vehicle. Or take Gene Haas, an American businessman who built Haas Automation into the largest maker of computer-controlled machine tools in North America, with sales exceeding $1 billion a year. He started a Formula One team in 2016 for one reason: to put his company's name on a car that travels to Europe, the Middle East, and Asia 20-something times a year, reaching industrial buyers who would never see a normal American advertisement. The racing team is a billboard that happens to also race. For sovereign wealth funds and private equity firms circling the sport today, the logic is even simpler: scarcity. There are only 10 teams. For decades, that number has barely moved, and even with an 11th team joining the grid recently, getting a seat at this table is nearly impossible without buying an existing one. When something is this rare and this visible, investors are often willing to accept a mediocre year of profit in exchange for owning a piece of an asset that keeps getting more valuable. The same way people buy real estate in a city that never builds anything new. Luxury conglomerates think about this the exact same way. The French group that owns brands like Louis Vuitton signed a 10-year sponsorship commitment with the sport, reportedly worth around $150 million a year, starting in 2025. Not because a suitcase brand needs to sell more suitcases to race fans, but because the paddock is one of the last places on Earth where a company can put its brand in front of billionaires, royalty, and heads of state in one afternoon, all without buying a single television ad. But none of that fully explains the jump from these teams losing tens of millions a year to being worth billions. For that, you need one single rule change. Before 2021, there was no cap on what a team could spend. The wealthiest manufacturer-backed teams were pouring over $400 million a year into the chase for a tenth of a second, while independent teams tried to survive on a fraction of that and usually failed. This is the exact environment that killed off teams like Caterham, which entered administration in 2014 owing more than £20 million, with a court-appointed administrator having to personally run the team just to keep it alive long enough to be sold. It's the same environment that ended Manor Racing in 2017, which collapsed after coming up just £500,000 short of the money it needed to make it to winter testing. All 212 staff lost their jobs the same week. Then the cost cap arrived, and something strange happened. Spending stopped being the thing that separated winners from losers, so the sport suddenly started looking less like an unlimited engineering arms race and more like a normal bounded business. Once a team's costs were capped, any growth in revenue, from prize money, from sponsorship, from media rights, started flowing straight to the bottom line instead of being reinvested into an endless spending war. The results were almost immediate. Mercedes reported a net profit of well over £100 million in a recent season. McLaren, a team that had spent years bleeding cash, turned itself into a consistently profitable operation. Even Williams, a team that had nearly gone under before being bought by the private equity firm Doralton Capital for around $200 million, is now valued north of $1 billion. Controlling costs, it turned out, was worth more to these businesses than winning ever was. But here's the thing about a sport built entirely around precision engineering at the edge of physical limits. Even with hundreds of millions of dollars behind you, the whole season can still come down to something the size of a coin. During a Formula One pit stop, mechanics use a pneumatic gun to remove and refit a single titanium wheel nut in under 2 seconds. At the Monaco Grand Prix in 2021, Valtteri Bottas came into the pits running comfortably in second place. The gun wasn't seated perfectly square on the nut. In that fraction of a second, the immense torque of the gun stripped the driving faces clean off the metal, rounding the nut against the axle so completely that the wheel could no longer be removed at all. His race ended right there in the garage. Mechanics eventually had to grind the nut off with a rotary tool back at the factory in England. One badly seated wheel gun, 1 second-place finish, gone. And because a single position in the championship can be worth $8 to $12 million by the end of the year, that fraction of a second in Monaco had a price tag attached to it, even if nobody said the number out loud at the time. Brakes tell a similar story. At the Austrian Grand Prix in 2020, both Haas cars retired after their brakes overheated so badly that the components failed outright. The team had shaped its brake ducts to favor aerodynamic efficiency over cooling, and the heat of that particular circuit exposed the trade-off in the worst possible way. This is the tightrope every reliability engineer in this sport walks every single day. Add weight to make a part safer, and the car gets slower. Shave weight to make the car faster, and a single seal, sensor, or fastener becomes the difference between a podium and a retirement. Remember what this business relies on: fixed costs and volatile results. And now you can see it play out inside a single component the size of a bottle cap. And these two failures are not rare exceptions. Across a 20-plus race season, dozens of components are pushed right up to their design limit, on purpose, because every gram saved is worth a fraction of a second, and every fraction of a second is worth real money by the end of the year. Most of the time, the gamble pays off quietly, and nobody outside the garage ever hears about it. Every so often, it doesn't, and a $2 part ends up costing the team a result worth 8 figures. So if reliability is this fragile, why don't teams just play it safe and stop pushing so hard? Because the sport built in a rule that punishes exactly that kind of restraint. It's called the Aerodynamic Testing Regulation, and it links how much wind tunnel time and computer simulation time a team is allowed to a single number, where they finished in the championship. The team that wins gets the least testing time the following season, somewhere around 70% of the baseline allowance. The team that finishes last gets the most, up around 115%. That means the very worst team on the grid gets roughly 45% more development time than the very best one. It's a deliberate leveling mechanism, and it means every hour in the wind tunnel becomes more precious the better you perform. This creates a strange kind of financial trap. In the old, uncapped era, a wealthy team could simply run its wind tunnel around the clock and brute force its way to a faster car. Now, with both budget and testing hours limited, spending $10 million on a new aerodynamic package might only buy you 1 or 2/10 of a second of lap time. And if the engineering team gets the simulation wrong, that $10 million can produce a part that's actually slower than what it replaced, with no budget left over to fix the mistake mid-season. Sounds like a system with no room for cheating. Well, almost in October of 2022, the FIA announced the result of its first full audit of the cost cap, covering the 2021 season, the very first year the rule existed. Red Bull Racing had gone over the limit. The published figure was a breach of just under $2 million against a cap of roughly £118 million, a little over 1.5% above the line. The overspend wasn't hidden in secret car parts. It came from things like staff catering, social security contributions, sick leave payments to an employee recovering from a serious illness, and how the team divided staff-up time between the race team and its newly formed engine division. Boring, almost invisible line items. The kind of thing that sounds more like an accounting error than a competitive advantage. But rival teams didn't see it that way. McLaren's team principal at the time argued in writing that any amount of extra spending, regardless of what it was labeled, freed up money elsewhere that could be poured straight into the car. Mercedes made a similar case, that even a couple of $1 million could fund a serious aerodynamic upgrade. Red Bull agreed to a settlement rather than fight it out. The penalty came in two parts: a $7 million fine paid directly to the FIA, and a 10% cut to their wind tunnel and simulation allowance for the following year, dropping their testing allocation from 70% of the baseline down to 63%. That one case proved something the whole paddock had suspected but never confirmed. In this era of the sport, a misfiled tax credit or an unexpectedly high catering bill can end up shaping who wins races the following season. Even with rules this strict and enforcement this real, something else was happening at the exact same time. Team ownership was turning into one of the most valuable positions in global sports. Rewind to late 2008. The car manufacturer Honda pulled out of Formula One entirely during the global financial crisis, abandoning its team in England. Two of its senior staff, Ross Brawn and Nick Fry, bought the entire operation for a symbolic sum of £1. Renamed Brawn GP, the team won both major championships the very next season and was sold to Mercedes a few months later for roughly $170 million. At the time, that sale, from a company bought for essentially nothing to a deal worth over $100 million in under a year, was considered one of the great success stories in the sport's history. That same team, now competing as Mercedes, is worth somewhere close to $6 billion today. That jump from around $170 million to roughly $6 billion on the very same team is the entire story of what happened to this sport's economics in under 2 decades. 3 things drove it. First, the sport's new owner, Liberty Media, rebuilt its audience from scratch after buying it in 2017, largely through a behind-the-scenes documentary series that turned unfamiliar drivers into recognizable characters for millions of new fans, especially in the United States. Second, scarcity. There are still only around 10 seats at this table, and buying an existing team is essentially the only way in, which is exactly the kind of restricted supply that makes any asset's price climb. Third, and most importantly, the cost cap severed the old link between a bad season on the track and a collapsing bank account. A team can now finish mid-pack for years and still be worth well over $1 billion because investors are pricing in the long-term value of owning one of only 10 global media franchises. Not this year's championship position. By 2025, the average Formula One team was worth somewhere around $3.5 billion, an increase of close to 50% in a single year, according to industry valuations. Ferrari sits at the very top, valued at somewhere between $6 and $7 billion. Mercedes isn't far behind, valued around $6 billion. Even Williams, a team that nearly went bankrupt before being bought for around $200 million, is now worth more than $1 billion. So if all this wealth exists, who is actually walking away with it? The answer depends entirely on which seat you're sitting in. Ferrari is unusual because its road car business is publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. While most car manufacturers trade at a modest multiple of their earnings, Ferrari trades at a luxury multiple more like 50 times earnings, roughly on par with the world's most exclusive fashion houses rather than other automakers. That premium exists largely because of the racing team's prestige. Ferrari sells fewer than 14,000 road cars a year worldwide on purpose, and the racing program is a huge part of why customers accept that kind of exclusivity and still pay for it. Team owners capture wealth differently, mostly through the rising value of their equity stake, which they only really realize the day they sell part or all of the team. The way Renault sold a chunk of its Alpine team to a group of investors for close to $1 billion valuation, only to watch that same stake more than double in under 3 years. But not everyone in the building benefits equally. Because almost all staff salaries fall under the cost cap, teams have to watch payroll closely to avoid breaching the limit, which means many of the engineers actually designing these cars are working under real pay pressure, while the very people the cap doesn't touch at all. Star drivers and the top 3 executives can earn tens of millions of dollars a year with no ceiling whatsoever. Inside the same factory, one group of employees operates under a strict financial ceiling, while another operates with none at all. Put real numbers next to each other, and the gap between success and failure in this business becomes obvious. In a strong year, a mid-table team might spend close to the full amount allowed under the cost cap, roughly $200 million once every uncapped item is added back in. Against that, it collects somewhere around $80 to $100 million in prize money for a solid finish, another $50 to $70 million from sponsorship, and perhaps $20 million more from ancillary business and manufacturer support. Add it up, and that team can walk away with a genuine operating profit in the tens of millions of dollars, on top of watching its own equity value climb by hundreds of millions more. Now take the same team and drop it 2 positions in the championship, the kind of swing that can come down to a single stripped wheel nut or an overheated brake. Prize money falls by $20 to $30 million. A major sponsor, unhappy with a season of retirements instead of finishes, doesn't renew at the same rate the following year, and that gap alone can run another $20 million. Costs barely move because the cost cap keeps spending roughly fixed whether the car finishes first or last. Suddenly, a team that expected a comfortable profit is looking at a loss of $30 to $40 million for the year. The difference between a good season and a bad one, for a team operating at this level, can be well over $100 million. And almost none of that swing comes from how much money the team spent. It comes from where the car finished. For the first 70 years of this sport's existence, a team's value was tied almost entirely to how good its engineers were and how much money its owner was willing to burn to make the car faster. Teams lost money because there was no limit on how much you could spend chasing a tenth of a second, and no protection if a rival simply outspent you. Today, the fastest car on the grid is no longer the primary product being sold. The team itself, with its guaranteed seat on a 10-team grid, its global broadcast audience, and its costs locked inside a firm ceiling, has become the asset. Winning races still matters enormously to the people racing, but to the people who actually own these teams, mid-pack finish inside a profitable, appreciating billion-dollar franchise can be a far better financial outcome than a championship inside a business that's still bleeding cash to get there. The next real shift in this sport's economics probably won't come from a wind tunnel or a new engine formula. It'll come from the answer to a much simpler question: who gets permission to buy the next seat at this table and what they'll have to pay to sit down?